morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've got another great show for you today. Let's get right to our top story, political news. Vice President Kamala Harris did, in fact, sit down for an interview where the journalist challenged her for a change. How about that? Here's a glimpse of Fox News' Bret Baier handling the VP on his program last night.
More than 70% of people tell the country is on the wrong track. They say the country is on the wrong track. If it's on the wrong track, that track follows 3.5 years of you being vice president and President Biden being president. That is what they're saying, 79% of them. Why are they saying that? If you're turning the page, you've been in office for 3.5 years.
And Donald Trump has been running for office.
But you've been the person holding the office.
Come on.
Madam
You
Vice
and I
President.
both know what I'm talking about. You and I both know what I'm talking about.
I actually don't. What are you talking about?
What I'm talking about is that over the last decade, people have become. But listen, over the last decade, it is clear to me, and certainly the Republicans who are on stage with me.
Harris did try and do some damage control after that question and separated herself from President Biden. Let's watch.
You're not Donald Trump, but nothing comes to mind that you would do differently?
Let me be very clear. My presidency will not be a continuation of Joe Biden's presidency. And like every new president that comes into office, I will bring my life experiences, my professional experiences, and fresh and new ideas. I represent a new generation of leadership. I, for example, am someone who has not spent the majority of my career in Washington, D.C. I invite ideas, whether it be from the Republicans who are supporting me, who were just on stage with me minutes ago, and the business sector, and others who can contribute to the decisions that I make about, for example, my plan for increasing the supply of housing in America and bringing down the cost of housing, addressing the issue of small businesses, which is about working with the private sector to bring more capital and access to capital to our small business leaders.
Baier also took the opportunity to press Harris on the administration's handling of the border. Baier named young women who were allegedly killed by men who had entered the country illegally.
Do you owe
Bret,
those families an apology?
Let me just say, first of all, those are tragic cases. There's no question about that. There is no question about that. And I can't imagine the pain that the families of those victims have experienced for a loss that should not have occurred. So that is true. It is also true that if a border security had actually been passed 9 months ago, it would be 9 months that we would have had more border agents at the border.
And things got a little spicy when Baier interrupted Harris. In fact, one could even call it talking over her. Let's watch.
Was a bill to fix our immigration system.
Yes, ma'am. It was called the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021.
Exactly.
It was essentially a pathway to citizenship for the... Yes, ma'am.
May I finish responding, please? But you have to let me finish,
You
please.
had the White House and the House and the Senate, and they didn't bring up that bill.
I'm in the middle of responding to the point you're raising, and I'd like to finish.
Yes.
Online, people seemed split along party lines as to how Harris fared. For example, Trump wrote on X, quote, "Great job by Bret Baier in his interview with Lion Kamala Harris. She has a massive and irredeemable case of Trump derangement syndrome." While Mark Cuban, the tech investor, wrote on X, quote, "The beautiful thing about the Bret Baier interview is that Kamala Harris understood and responded to each question. She used examples of policies. She gave real-world context. When Bret went after her, she didn't call him names and she didn't quit the interview." Meanwhile, over on MSNBC, the hosts were fuming over Baier's handling of the interview. Let's listen to Mika.
As you saw, it almost immediately devolved into an embarrassing bad faith effort by a once respected host to play to an audience of one. The host's constant, rude interruptions were designed to distract from the issues and facts that Trump and his acolytes try and twist and distort every day, and on Fox News they try and avoid.
Elon Musk poked fun of the mainstream media's nearly identical headlines. He wrote on X, quote, "Testy is this week's sharp as a tack." And the Mika reaction to me, Niall, is the most unhinged one of all, because I thought it was a pretty good interview. I don't think Kamala Harris bombed, and I'm pretty, harsh on her in general. I also don't think, the Fox audience watching is going to be, wow, I got to take a second look at this person. Maybe I'm going to vote for. But I think she did a pretty good job. I think, Bret did a good job. At times, butting in, interrupting. I think if you do a little bit of that, it's fine. I don't think it went so far over the line that it was rude. I think she handled it well. It was a pretty good interview. It got into some real subjects on immigration, tried to hold her accountable. She did her best to explain what her positions are and distance herself from the administration. Again, I don't think it's going to put a ton new percentage points in the Kamala Harris votes for her category, but I don't think she bombed by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I mean, first things first, Kamala Harris did this interview with a network that she knew would be somewhat adversarial to her, and, credit to her for doing that. And not just credit to her, credit for Trump when he does it in reverse. I, as a reporter, would prefer much more occurrences of interviews where people go on knowing that they will be met with rigorous questioning. Like you, I did not think Bret Baier went over the line. Maybe you could argue that one that we showed there where he was interrupting a little much, maybe you could argue that was slightly too aggressive. But, the Mika comment that we played, it's interesting that she talks about Baier purportedly playing to an audience. So much of the problem that I have with a good portion of cable news, not all, but a good portion, is that it's just playing to its audience all the time and just reinforcing whatever views they wish to have. So when the Democrat gets questioned by a Fox interviewer, MSNBC called that rude. If MSNBC takes a pop at Trump, Fox comes to his defense, and it becomes rather predictable. As for the interview itself, in brief, Robby, I do think that if you're looking at it from a political standpoint, to state the obvious, it's up to the interviewer to select the questions, and significant chunks of this interview were spent on immigration and, to a lesser extent, the trans issue. And neither of those, I don't think, are to Kamala Harris's benefit. So I'm not sure that she gets, among any sort of swing voters, she may get some abstract credit for going on Fox, but I don't think her defending herself, on immigration is going to really sway people very much.
Yeah, I mean, the reason to do this and the way that it helps her is now it deprives the other side of a little bit of ammunition in making the case that she's afraid of confrontational interviews, that she avoids the press, that she'll only talk to people she agrees with under narrow circumstances, that she's not out there and, she can't stand up, she can't take the heat, right? That's something that I've said a lot because she has not done very many interviews compared with any other candidate in her position, part of that being the novelty of her suddenly becoming the candidate so late in the game. But this does, sap that line of attack of a little bit of its potency. And from her standpoint, that's a good thing, even if it isn't winning a bunch of new voters. It changes the narrative a little bit. I was interested to see her always highlight one of the policies that I think is the easiest to criticize among her things she's proposing to do, the housing thing. Look, I would love to make housing more affordable for Americans. This is a huge issue. Housing costs are astronomical in a lot of places in the country. That has to do with tight regulation of zoning and labor and the costs of building, construct, all of that kind of stuff. And really the zoning being a major part of it, and how many occupants are going to be in a certain building in a certain area. The story is all this time of neighborhoods using their power to shut down new development, that kind of thing. And her solution, which she touted to Bret Baier, again, is to give $25,000 to new home buyers. That's going to go directly into the pricing of houses going up. And I really don't think it's a good idea. Again, if you're an existing homeowner, maybe this is a nice plan because then you can raise the price of your house if you're going to sell it. But she, again, talked about that one. She does have a lot of smart business people on her side. Mark Cuban has, on some level, become her most, I think, persuasive person out there making the case to pro-business, pro-market, some tech libertarian people. Obviously, there's a lot of support for Trump in that tech, Peter Thiel world. Mark Cuban's also kind of in that world and is making the case for Kamala and is doing a pretty good job of it. But this is not her best policy, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can discuss, of course, the rights and wrongs of that policy and whether it would do what it sets out to do. I think the political utility of it is at least the appearance that she is trying to address an issue that is something that people feel very deeply. And it's part of this bigger argument that she seeks to make, that she is focused on trying to do things like that, whereas Trump, in her view, is basically too much of a narcissist to worry over much about those kinds of things. Just briefly, Robby, in terms of the things that this interview sort of rebutted in terms of common attacks upon her, I did think when she appeared to get legitimately angry about what she sees as Trump's authoritarian tendencies, I actually thought that was quite effective for her, because it did show her being a bit more passionate and a bit less cautious and calculated, as we often portray her as being.
Coming up next on Rising, I have a radar for you all about the Kamala Harris plagiarism allegations. Stay tuned for that.
Robby, what's on your radar?
Well, Niall, in 2009, Kamala Harris co-authored a book called Smart on Crime, a career prosecutor's plan to make us safer. Now, its purpose was to outline her criminal justice policies in advance of her campaign for California Attorney General. The book has attracted the attention of conservative writer and activist Christopher Rufo, who contends that Harris and co-author Joan O.C. Hamilton plagiarized several passages. Rufo's analysis, which relies on the work of Stefan Weber, a noted exposer of plagiarism, finds that there are at least 12 sections of the book in which sentences or entire paragraphs were copied from another source without proper attribution. Taken in total, there is certainly a breach of standards here, writes Rufo. Harris and her co-author duplicated long passages nearly verbatim without proper citation and without quotation marks, which is the textbook definition of plagiarism. They not only lifted material from sources without proper attribution, but in at least one case, relied on a low-quality source which potentially undermined the accuracy of their conclusion. End quote. That is from Rufo. Readers may disagree, of course, about the severity of some aspects of the plagiarism. Harris borrowing from her own work or not paraphrasing sufficiently, maybe that's not such a problem. But there are more striking examples of entire passages in the book being lifted from other sources without citation. This is definitely a no-no and does, in fact, meet the standard definition of plagiarism. Now, similar transgressions helped to end the career of Harvard University President Claudine Gay, who resigned after conservative writers, including Rufo, but initially the Washington Free Beacon's Aaron Sibarium was all over that. They uncovered numerous instances of plagiarism in her academic work. One can certainly argue that Gay, a professional academic and leader of the most prestigious educational institution in the country, should be held to a higher standard than Harris. But plagiarism is often taken very seriously when politicians are caught engaging in it. In fact, then-Senator Joe Biden's first stab at running for president all the way back in 1988 came to an abrupt end after it was discovered that he had plagiarized a speech from a British Labour Party leader. Indeed, even plagiarism involving merely quasi-political figures attracts considerable media attention. Remember in 2016, Melania Trump gave a speech at the Republican National Convention. A section of that speech contained phrasing that was in fact similar to a previous speech made by Michelle Obama. The media did not hold back. In recapping this incident, Vox reported that the plagiarism episode was, quote, one of the biggest stories from the RNC, that the Trump campaign's refusal to address it had, quote, made a bad situation worse. Vox even wondered whether the plagiarism allegations would, quote, damage Trump's image with voters, a concern that seems downright quaint by today's standards. CNN had a field day with that story, publishing half a dozen articles and videos about it, featuring side-by-side comparisons of what Melania said versus what Michelle said. The Associated Press reported that plagiarism had marred Melania Trump's moment. The Washington Post did not hold back at all, described the Trump campaign's defense of Melania as ridiculous, with the word ridiculous actually appearing twice in the same headline. The higher education news site, an authority on plagiarism, Inside Higher Ed, wrote that yes, it was plagiarism, and the scandal, quote, shouldn't be trivialized. The plagiarism allegations were covered by NPR, they were covered by The New Yorker, they were covered by The Guardian, the BBC, and of course, The New York Times. Quote, how Melania's speech veered off course and caused an uproar. That's what the Times headline said. One might expect plagiarism allegations against an actual presidential candidate, rather than just their spouse, to merit similar or greater outrage from the media. But the Harris allegations have not attracted nearly the same level of interest or scrutiny. In fact, their ire is directed not at Harris for plagiarizing, get this, but at Rufo for uncovering it. CNN's report on the Harris plagiarism accusations is headlined, Conservative Activist Accuses Harris of Plagiarizing Passages in Co-authored 2009 Book. Note that the identity of the accuser, of the plagiarism discoverer, was not at issue in the Michelle Obama-Melania Trump case. But here, mainstream media feels compelled to position Rufo rather than Harris at the center of the controversy. Conservatives, by the way, complain ceaselessly about this, and not without reason. They say that scandals involving Republicans, conservatives, and Trump world personalities are reported in straightforward fashion, whereas scandals involving Democrats, liberals, and the media itself are not. In these cases, the media focuses on the motivations, agendas, and responses of conservatives who are involved in surfacing the controversy. Now, this is often done in headlines using this exact phrasing, Republicans pounce on X, or Republicans seize on X, where X is the thing that Democrats did wrong. This is such a well-worn trope, it's a meme by now, that one might have actually expected, I would have expected, mainstream media institutions to take greater pains to avoid it, if only to deprive conservatives of ammunition. And yet, oh no, the New York Times write-up of the Harris plagiarism accusations is headlined, quote, Conservative Activist Seizes on Passages from Harris Book. They did it exactly the way conservatives say they do it. Now, this article itself minimizes the extent of Harris's wrongdoing and cites a plagiarism expert named Jonathan Bailey, who claimed for the article, for the Times, that Rufo was, quote, making a big deal out of relatively minor transgressions. The Times did not share with him the full list of plagiarized passages in the book. Christopher Rufo then did so, and on his website, Bailey then noted, after reviewing all of the additional allegations, that the case is, quote, more serious than he first thought, although he does maintain that Harris did not engage in, quote, wholesale fraud. He said it was in between these two categories. Now look, I think it's perfectly fine for journalists to report on the agendas of conservative activists who are making such claims. Rufo does not deny that he is politically motivated. On the contrary, if you follow him on X, he is constantly explaining his agenda and explaining his strategy for implementing it. There's nothing hidden or secretive or shadowy about it. But perhaps the New York Times could be bothered to treat this allegation, plagiarism by the sitting vice president and Democratic candidate for the presidency, as seriously as a speech by Melania Trump.
So, interesting thoughts there, Robby, and I do take a lot of those points, including that trope that is used and overused about conservatives seize on something as a way to blunt the wrongdoing or the alleged wrongdoing. And for what it's worth, I try to avoid that in my own work. I do think it's interesting that this allegation did emanate from Christopher Rufo, and I don't say that to undercut the seriousness of it. Some of the headlines you mentioned don't seem to be defensible, given that there does appear to be evidence of some level of plagiarism. But I was trying, as I was listening to you, to think about what the comparison would be on the left, and I couldn't think of an exact analogue to Christopher Rufo, but if Joy Reid, for example, made an accusation against a conservative about plagiarism, I think that it would probably be pretty widely noted that it was Joy Reid making the allegation. So I don't think that part's invalid, but I do take your point on some of the framing.
Yeah, and look, if people want to say, okay, this was a 2009 book and there was some badly paraphrased, parts where it should be in quotes and it's not in quotes, it's just a footnote, but you do have to put it in quotes. But, I'm still going to vote for her because I agree with her policies. Yeah, that's fine. If I was otherwise inclined to vote for a presidential candidate and something like this came out, it probably wouldn't sway me. And I also think you can make the case that an academic in the Harvard University president case, it was pretty aggressively bad, given that she's the leader of an academic institution and comes from academia and really ought to know better. And Harris co-wrote this book, and, you know, if we're all being honest with ourselves, who do we think actually wrote the book? Probably the other person, not Kamala Harris. Still, it suggests, you know, some sloppiness and should be called out. I just think the double standards really do grate with people. And why can't they, and I know you do this in your own reporting because you're a better journalist, do New York Times people not know? Do they not hear that everyone on the right is always making fun of the pounce, seize? It's those two words. It's the same words, and they did it here. I would think this would have permeated their bubble by now. It's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the capacity or the propensity to ignore those critiques which get at a bigger issue are very surprising, because even if you're going from a liberal perspective, you're simply handing ammunition to your critics, which I find perplexing.
Coming up next, RFK Jr. is speaking out about a case of censorship in Israel. We'll talk about that. Former presidential candidate RFK Jr. is calling for an American journalist who was detained while reporting in Israel to be freed. Now, RFK Jr. wrote, quote, "My commitment to Israel's security and survival is absolute, so is my dedication to press freedom. That is why I am calling for the freedom of American journalist Jeremy Loffredo, who was detained while reporting in Israel. Having worked with Jeremy at Children's Health Defense, I know him as a tenacious and professional young reporter. I urge the U.S. State Department to work for his immediate return home." Now, for context, Jeremy Loffredo was one of 5 journalists reportedly detained by Israel's Defense Forces on October 9th. He is allegedly charged with endangering national security and aiding and sharing information with the enemy because of his reporting on Iranian strikes. It's a serious crime that carries a maximum sentence of life imprisonment or even death, according to The Intercept. Loffredo has been released from custody, but he's been ordered to remain in the country until October 20th, allowing investigators more time to build their case.
In other freedom of speech news, Columbia University has temporarily barred a pro-Israel professor from campus. The school says the professor, Shay Davidai, repeatedly intimidated and harassed fellow employees. Davidai has accused Columbia of not doing enough to crack down on pro-Palestinian protests, which he calls anti-Semitic, according to the New York Times. Plus, recently Davidai has accused student groups of supporting terrorism. He did that in postings on X. He also posted the name and email of a Columbia professor, suggesting that professor was, quote, okay with rape, murder, torture, and kidnapping, end quote. Davidai was temporarily restricted from campus once before. That was back in April, after he planned to go to a pro-Palestinian protest and shout the names of hostages held by Hamas.
Well, let's start with this situation in Israel. I'm glad RFK Jr. is speaking out about this. RFK Jr. is very supportive of Israel. I know that actually frustrated some of his former friends and allies on the left. He sparred with Brianna Joy Gray on this show about it numerous times. But however, he is committed to freedom of speech, and I think is correct to point out that this is an appalling case. It is a freedom of speech, freedom of the press issue. This is our ally. This is a country who often it is made the case that one of the reasons to support Israel is because it is a Western-style democracy that defends Enlightenment values. So it must live up to those, including freedom of speech, journalism, etc. So I think this is utterly contemptible that they're building this case. And again, the administration, he's a U.S. citizen, Biden, Harris, Trump, whoever's going to be our next president, should actually do something about this.
So firstly, on the RFK Jr. question, I mean, I have been critical of him at other times, so I want to tip my hat to him on this one, because he's doing something that I think is pretty important generally in our political culture, which is defending the right of someone with whom he disagrees quite strongly on the position or the issue under consideration, which is Israel and its conduct of its operations in Gaza and elsewhere. So I think due credit to him for doing that. The specifics of the case would be a little too complicated to go into, but Kennedy is really standing up for the principle of press freedom there, and I think that's very admirable. The Columbia case I view very, very differently, because I don't think that the professor who has been barred there really applies the principles that he purports to believe in universally at all. As we noted in the introduction, he has tried to get student groups suspended or extend their suspensions. He has called people, I mean, he's basically defamed people in my book, calling, for example, a very respected scholar of that issue at Columbia, pro-Hamas, of which there's no evidence to at all. So I find him, or I put him in a very different category to the situation that RFK Jr. is drawing attention to.
Yeah, look, I think this guy, David, I think his antics are certainly over the line, and he's just knee-jerk calling everyone terrorist supporter. I don't think he's doing himself a lot of, or he's demonstrating that he has a lot of credibility by, wielding that accusation so wildly, so widely. That said, he should have a free speech right to do that. If he's defaming people, you have the legal procedures to deal with that. The idea that he's harassing his coworkers, this does start to get into a tricky middle ground, because a Columbia University as a workplace, if you were constantly barraging some colleague with inappropriate or harassing emails or messages, as a workplace, it could do something without, I would argue, violating necessarily free speech issues. But if it's just he's posting really aggressive criticism, maybe wrong criticism or mean criticism of them on social media, then I don't think it really crosses into that line to bar him from campus. Well, he can actually still talk about it on social media. So that doesn't even, the main problem is that he keeps saying really not kind and nutty things about people on social media. Barring him from campus doesn't even accomplish that. If the barring him from campus is because he's been getting in people's faces, again, at some point, this is a sort of behavior that even non-ideologically, I do think a university can take some steps to deter or prevent. I don't know what steps they've taken up until now. I would like to know more about that. Did you try to speak to him about, conduct unbecoming of a professor, that sort of thing? And is there a double standard being applied? Because I'm sure many pro-Israel people, if they're watching or listening, will say, well, what about XYZ, Gaza supporting student or professor who's been out there waving banners in people's faces or, saying things that, and again, I'm not describing this entirely as the response to people protesting on Gaza's behalf, but we have seen signs that are supportive not just of the Palestinians, but of Hamas and of the events of October 7th. So are these things being dealt with in the same way? So it is a little bit messy and complicated, I would say.
It is. I mean, I think there is an important distinction, excuse me, for a start, between freedom of speech and workplace conduct. The professor isn't the only person who has rights here. Columbia University as an employer has rights. People have a right as students at that university or as employees of that university to be free from harassment. The suggestion is that he followed at least two members of two employees, I guess, or administrators at Columbia around filming them and berating them, and then posted those clips. And, I couldn't do that to anybody who works at the Hill or on Rising, and rightly so. That would be, I think, crossing the line into harassment. The other point about double standards, Robby, and this is where I really have kind of issues with this guy. He, at one stage, encouraged people to sign an email or to send a pro forma email about to try to extend the suspension of pro-Palestinian groups. And his argument in part was that the phrase "from the river to the sea" was sufficient to have those people suspended because it places, as he put it, Jewish students in danger, or as that email put it. Now, to me, you can argue about the phrase "from the river to the sea," but he is arguing that the free speech rights of protesters that he doesn't agree with should be undercut or suppressed or whatever, while he takes for himself the most expansive interpretation of free speech rights possible. And that's where I have the main problem.
I don't agree with his attitude on free speech. I think those people do deserve, I've defended the rights of the largest campus pro-Palestinian groups, even ones that have, in my view, more definitively and explicitly endorsed or shown sympathy for the actions of October 7th. I think even if you've done that, your group should not be banned from campus or anything of that nature. But I mean, I would say that free speech is even for people who are not, extending it to others. So I would say that I am unconvinced that his conduct rises, while maybe very obnoxious and wrongheaded and probably not consistent with my views of the conflict at all, I'm not at all persuaded that his actions are sufficiently over the line in a kind of workplace safety way where he should be barred from campus. But I'd be interested to hear what more, expert people like my friends at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, who cover a lot of free speech cases and have defend pro-Israel people and pro-Palestine people, I'd be interested to see what they say about this specific case. So we might follow up on that at a later date. For now, coming up next, what happens when the FBI unexpectedly knocks on your door? You might be Ken Klippenstein. We're going to interview him next. Well, even the best writers need editors. That said, few journalists I know would want the FBI to serve in that role. Now, in this era of highly polarized veins of information, the FBI making it known that they're watching and reading what's being written. Now, according to independent journalist Ken Klippenstein, he heard a knock at his door last week, only to find out it was a special agent from the FBI. Ken wrote on his Substack that there was no subpoena, no search warrant, no prior announcement, no claims of illegal behavior. Had to do with him having published the J.D. Vance dossier, which he obtained from presumably an Iranian hacker, got him briefly for some time suspended as well from Twitter, and a visit from the FBI. Are they delivering a chilling message? We know where you live, we know what you're doing, and we are watching?
Now, Ken says the agent told him he had been the target of a foreign influence operation, as Robby mentioned, and that was with regard to a news article he had written, which is indeed thought to be a reference to the publication of the Trump campaign's opposition dossier on J.D. Vance. Here to tell Rising more about what happened to him is Ken Klippenstein himself. Hey, Ken.
Hey, guys. Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. So, I mean, we've laid out, I think, pretty fairly what happened there. Now, people can get into the debate about where this document originated from, how there can be different security considerations perhaps around that. But the thing that struck me reading your account of this was obviously the FBI literally calling at your door to your house. It does seem that this could literally have been an email if the real purpose was just to say, we think you've been the target of a foreign influence operation. So what was your reaction? What did you make of it? And did the FBI agent explain anything that would answer that question I just raised?
So when they visited, I asked them, I kind of joked, I was like, well, what took you guys so long? Because I knew that the FBI would be watching this. I mentioned prominently in the story that this is very likely of Iranian origin, that they have an interest in former President Trump losing, since he has a harder line set of policies on Iran. And so the special agent replied, well, when did you write the story? I said 2 weeks ago. And he says, well, that's pretty fast for the federal government. And so there was a kind of comic aspect at the same time that there was a concerning one about the role of the federal government and why they didn't just send an email, like you said, which I think would be the easiest way to have handled this. But then I asked him also, I said, he had a prepared statement. It was about a paragraph long, maybe 4 sentences or so. And the whole thing was very stilted and weird. He had it on a clipboard and he says, okay, I'm supposed to read you the statement. So he reads me the statement telling me basically what you just said, that I've been the target of a foreign influence operation. And then I replied to him, I said, yes, I know. I said that in my article. I said that this is very likely of Iranian origin. And then I said, so that being the case, what was the point of this? And he was stumped. He just was like, look, man, I got sent out here to read this. I don't really know. And then he said, I haven't read the article. And so it was both Kafkaesque, but also this kind of absurdist quality to all of it. Because I was like, what, you didn't read the article, but they sent you out here? He said, I'm just supposed to read this. And so he was sort of puzzled by the whole thing too. Didn't have an answer to what the point of telling me something I already knew was. And, it was a short meeting. He said he had other things to do. And so after that, he left. And that was that. I think of this from the perspective of many other reporters who maybe aren't national security reporters. It didn't have a chilling effect on me. I'm happy to continue publishing other things should I get them. But I have to imagine that most people get a visit like this and have a certain response. And I wonder if that's why the media in total uniformity has declined to run these things without exception. Every other outlet would not run either the Vance dossier or the other hacked materials that the Iranians are shopping around.
Yeah, you and I had a longer conversation about this the other day for the publication, the show Unheard, and you pointed out, and I absolutely agree with you, that it is so strange that numerous mainstream journalistic outlets was given this same information and said, you know what, there's nothing really to see here, we're not going to publish it. Or that's the excuse they gave. Now, it could be, right. I suspect it is, and I think you suspect it is, that in this era of heightened panic, or we would maybe argue moral panic about the level of foreign influence and how damaging that has been to democracy, there is greater reticence than there would have been before to publish this kind of thing if it was obtained illicitly. In the past, journalistic mainstream outlets have not shied from publishing if they think there's reason to do it. Now, you can't, steal the documents yourself and then publish them, because the stealing is a crime, but this fell into their hands, fell into your hands, and all of them made the same decision except for you.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly right. These media organizations, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, they're not going to come out and say, oh, we're afraid of the federal government, or, oh, we feel ourselves deputized into the role of carrying out the federal government's war on foreign malign influence, as they call it. They're not going to admit that. They're going to have to say something else, which is, I think, what they've said. There was nothing newsworthy in it. Nothing newsworthy about the vice presidential nominee and the 171-page long list of his policies and what the campaign considered noteworthy about them. I find that very hard. I mean, it just doesn't pass the smell test. And so if it's not that, then what is it? And I have to imagine it's either fear, perhaps at them having gotten visits from the Bureau as well, which is something that has not happened in the past. I couldn't find any examples of the Justice Department does have a notification process for things like social media companies and tech companies, other firms, but I've not seen this happen with news media before. So I think this is a new program. And perhaps they received a similar visit and they came to a different conclusion, which was, oh gosh, maybe we shouldn't run this. Or I think there's a very unhealthy development in the kind of political culture, which is that everyone feels themselves deputized into the role of, fighting the federal government's wars on whether it's disinformation, foreign disinformation. And you see it in the discourse. Instead of just describing things as false or incorrect, or my favorite everything is disinformation now, which implies that there's some kind of shadowy actor propagating this stuff on purpose, instead of just your uncle sharing some weird meme that maybe he fell for and didn't really think very hard about. So I think there's just been a huge shift culturally in people feeling kind of like the Department of Homeland Security says, see something, say something, where people feel like, oh, now I have to be a part of this war. And I think it's very unhealthy, especially when it affects the news media, which is supposed to be independent of the federal government.
I'm curious, Ken, just in terms of your decision to publish the dossier in the first place. You pointed out in your first remarks there that you rightly were pretty forthright about the fact that you did think it probably came from some manner of Iranian source. And obviously any journalist, independent or otherwise, is balancing different imperatives about the newsworthiness. Is there private information? Is there information that would place people in danger? All of that. Did your recognition of the fact that it probably came from an Iranian source change the calculus for you in any way? Like, do you think there are genuine concerns there, even if you thought they were outweighed in this case by the public imperative to see the document?
Anytime something comes from a foreign adversary, it raises the bar a little bit, and you have to think about, okay, what is the public interest? What is this adversary interest? But again, going back to what I said before, I really try to avoid seeing myself as some kind of James Jesus Angleton of the media that's supposed to worry about that's the federal government's responsibility to fight those things. I do not think that that's the media's responsibility. If I answer you candidly, yes, I can't avoid thinking about those things. I'm an American. I care about the country. I don't want it to be hurt. But I think that the focus of the news media has to be in its role in informing people about stuff that's important, not in being seconded into some kind of war on foreign adversaries.
And you think the mainstream media is too prone to being seconded in that fashion by implication, right?
I think so. Not just the news media. I should be clear about this. The general public, too. After 2016, I think that there's been something of a hysteria, which is not to say that foreign malign influence campaigns don't exist. They clearly do. There's an abundance of evidence for it. But what is not discussed is how effective are they? And what is a proportional amount of concern to be afforded to them, which I don't think is stopping publishing things. I think that the response to it has been wildly out of proportion to the threat, because there is no evidence that foreign malign influence campaigns have succeeded at swinging, certainly not a presidential election, much less other prominent elections. And so I just wish that there was some amount of rationality that looked at, okay, what are the stakes here? What are the potential consequences? And I think if people did look at that, and there's good scholarship on this, Rand Corporation did a great study on Russian foreign malign influence campaigns, which, by the way, are described by the intelligence community as being much more dangerous to the U.S. than Iranian influence operations. The Rand Corporation concluded that they're poorly executed, poorly organized, and generally incompetent. And I think that's basically what the facts show. But there's never any discussion of that for a number of reasons. One being that the media has a lot of incentive to sensationalize and to make things sound more ominous than perhaps they are. You look at a case like the Iranians, they do not have the experience and the practice that the Russians have of 50 years of the Cold War to know how to construct propaganda that is persuasive to the American people. And I think that's what you see with these particular hacks. I mean, I don't think it made J.D. Vance look bad. I didn't think it made Trump look bad, any worse than what people already think about them. So I think that I just think that people are responding sort of hysterically to this whole thing.
Ken Klippenstein, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Coming up next, we have some breaking news. Israel is investigating the possibility that they might have killed the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. Stay tuned.
The Israeli military said Thursday it was looking into whether Hamas's top leader, Yahya Sinwar, was killed in a military operation in Gaza. The Israel Defense Forces said, quote, "At this stage, the identity of the terrorists cannot be confirmed," end quote, and it is testing the DNA of one of the deceased to see whether that is indeed Sinwar. Now, this is a fast-moving story. You may know more by the time you're watching than at the time we're speaking, but for context, Sinwar was one of the chief architects behind the October 7th attacks on Israel. He has been in hiding throughout the war, and he was chosen as Hamas's top leader in July following the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh.
The killing of Sinwar would of course be a victory for Israeli forces and may raise the question of whether military operations in Gaza could perhaps wind down. So this is a developing story, as you pointed out, Niall. I would expect to receive more details shortly regarding whether Sinwar was in fact killed. That is, I would say, the working assumption right now of a number of political leaders and commentators. There are images now on social media of a person who was killed during this Israeli operation who does look to be Sinwar. Now, again, that's being verified. It might not be him, but if it is him, that would be welcome, part of the justification for the operations, I would say, undertaken by Israel was a response, a legitimate response to October 7th, which was masterminded by this man, killing or capturing or forcing the surrender of this top Hamas leader was a stated goal of Netanyahu and Israeli leadership. And if that is accomplished, one would hope we could then we could transition toward having peace in this region, peace for the innocent people in Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, several things about this. Firstly, I have never been one to minimize the horror of what happened on October 7th. I have, on this show, among other places, given my view of the Israeli counter-operation, which I think has been unnecessarily and gratuitously brutal and savage. But the attacks of October 7th were horrendous, and this man was almost universally acknowledged as the mastermind of them. So, no tears for Yahya Sinwar. Now, the question of whether the operations could wind down, I mean, I would hope so from a basic humanitarian perspective. I wonder about that. I mean, we've talked a lot about the fact that the Israeli government has so many very, very hard right members in it, people who have suggested that part of the goal could be the reoccupation of parts of the Gaza Strip. I don't expect that those people are going to go away or be seated now that Yahya Sinwar may be dead. The other point in all this, Robbie, of course, is the fate of the remaining hostages in Gaza. We don't know exactly how that would play out. Would Sinwar's death, if confirmed, change that. He had been reported to be a more hardline figure in resisting a truce. For my money, Netanyahu has also resisted and moved the goalposts on a truce from the other side. But it does, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of potentially killing one leader, because I think ideologies are more important than leaders, and the capacity of those ideologies to command loyalty and support. But obviously he was the central figure, and if he is dead, we'll see what that changes.
Yeah, there's, I think, no doubt that one terrorist leader will be replaced with another, and unfortunately this cycle of violence will continue. However, for optics and for the purposes of exercising some restraint and control over the situation from the U.S. perspective, we've seen all this reporting in just the last 48 hours about the level of frustration the Biden administration has, Blinken issuing ultimatums saying there needs to be a peace deal, that this can no longer go on. Now, of course, they've been saying this all the way through the entire conflict, and it has not deterred or stopped or influenced or changed the Israeli government's behavior whatsoever. But if you are looking for an opportunity to unfurl the mission accomplished banner and move toward a different phase of this war, this would seem to me like an opportunity to do so. They have now, if this is confirmed, we're again still awaiting that, but if they have killed the leader of Hamas who was responsible for the terrorist attack that they were responding to, that does lend itself towards saying, okay, now maybe it doesn't need to be this, very concentrated and mass civilian casualty conflict in the region.
Yes, I mean, certainly because Sinwar was so personally identified as the mastermind. And I do think that that means that if he has been killed, it is different even from the comparatively recent killing of Mr. Haniyeh, who was also a very senior, obviously the top Hamas figure, but not so identified with the actual planning and execution of those attacks. So it does potentially have that capacity to serve as something that gives political cover if, and I would stress as a very big if, Netanyahu does want to wind these operations down. My fear would be that the focus has now shifted to some extent to Lebanon. I mean, Israel has invaded Lebanon, and I've frankly always been skeptical about Mr. Netanyahu's desire to make peace, because he has his own selfish political and legal reasons for not wanting that, including investigations of corruption into him personally, and the likelihood that he would face questions about the security failures that occurred on October 7th as well.
I think that's very fair. I'm concentrating on the U.S. part of it. If our leadership was looking for an excuse to really draw the line and then enforce it and then say, no more, that's enough, you have accomplished the goal of killing the person responsible for this terrorist attack, which was a legitimate goal of yours, but now we are drawing a hard line. This is now a reason to do that on our side. And again, if that comes with an actual threat of withdrawing support or funding or that sort of thing, the thinking should be that Netanyahu has no choice. Or if he wants to continue this without our total backing, well, then that's a choice that Israeli leadership can make, and the people of Israel can decide whether that's what they want. But then we will no longer be responsible for, on the hook for, and targeted by terrorists who associate us with the Israeli war efforts.
Right, absolutely. And of course, this comes so close to our own presidential election here. The salience of this issue has risen again because of some of the horrendous things we have seen. And now that Sinwar may be dead, does that enable, does that reduce I don't want to say the importance of this issue so much, but the degree to which it has the capacity to really harm Kamala Harris's chances by dividing the Democratic Party? I think if the Israelis just blitz on after this, then America has a choice to make and the Biden-Harris administration has a choice to make. But it'll be just curious to see how this politically plays out here as well as in Israel and the Middle East.
Coming up later on Rising, we have an interview with presidential candidate, Green Party leader Jill Stein. You won't want to miss that. Please stay with us. The Kamala Harris campaign has become increasingly negative toward third-party candidates, even running an attack ad against Green Party candidate Jill Stein. It's the view of Democrats the defenders of democracy, that any vote for Jill Stein is in fact the same thing as a vote for Trump. Stein is polling at 1% in some northern swing states, and that could end up being the margin of victory for the winning candidate in a state like Michigan, where uncommitted voters and many Arab Americans are not happy with either Harris or Trump, or Joe Biden and his policies for that matter. Here now to discuss is none other than Dr. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. Welcome back to Rising.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much. Good to see you, Robby.
Great to see you, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to so many of these attacks now coming from Democrats really focused on you. What do you say to the Democrat who contends that if anyone votes for you, they are voting for Donald Trump?
Well, that's BS, can I say? And the American people think that that's BS. The American people are actually clamoring for other choices in this election. Going into this election, Gallup poll showed, some 60% approximately of Americans were really hungry for another major party, another choice, because the two major parties have done such a poor job of serving the American people. Americans are struggling in virtually every dimension of our lives, on healthcare, on the crisis of housing, with half of Americans struggling to make their monthly, their monthly rent or mortgage, and the incredible student debt and medical debt and a climate crisis that's going, bonkers right now. And we don't have money for FEMA to assist really, people who've been hit very hard in devastated communities. But that amount of money, some $9 billion approximately, was just given to Israel and Bibi Netanyahu for the purpose of expanding his war, his genocidal war, and so on. The American people want other choices, and so many, Muslims in particular, do not want to cast a vote that endorses genocide. So the American people are entitled to other choices, and they're also entitled to a debate. And I would say bring it on, because the more Democrats draw attention to the fact that there are other choices, and there is a public interest choice, which is not bought and paid for by the usual big donors in Wall Street and the war machine, the more that people see that they actually have other choices, the more excited and enthusiastic people are to support our campaign. If you just look at the comments, on that episode yesterday here on Breaking Points, or on the Breakfast Club, or the live Q&A session done with Newsweek, these are not green audiences, but overwhelmingly the comments are very much in support of our campaign. So many of them saying they weren't going to vote in this election, and now they are going out to register green and vote for Steinway.
I just wanted to hone in on one of the issues you mentioned there, Dr. Stein, because, of course, very recently at the weekend, we had Lloyd Austin and Tony Blinken writing this letter that purported to suggest that the administration could consider cutting off arms to Israel if it didn't increase the supply of humanitarian aid to Gaza. But of course, the deadline for that was beyond the date of the presidential election. What did you make of that letter and that proposal?
Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. President Biden said basically the same thing before the major offensive against Rafah at the southern border of Gaza. He said the same thing, that if there was a destructive, intense invasion and a lot of civilian deaths in Rafah, that there would be consequences in terms of the weapon supply, and there were absolutely none. The Biden-Harris administration has had no red line whatsoever, and most recently they rewarded Israel with billions more when it began extending this genocidal war into Lebanon, where people are being devastated and killed now by the thousands, with essentially the same kind of carpet bombing campaign that's begun, that's been taking place in Gaza. The destruction has also extended to the West Bank. There's now a major initiative that's pending towards Iran as well. So, we're seeing massive expansion of this war. It's basically Bibi Netanyahu's war. He's been given the freedom basically to set U.S. foreign policy here in a very dangerous and risky setting. He's being allowed to do that without red lines, without any consequences. This is already violating U.S. laws, 3 of them, which say that the U.S. may not provide military support to any country that is interfering with the delivery of humanitarian aid, that is violating human rights, and that stands in violation of nuclear weapons treaties, which Israel is in violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there are reasons right here and now why it is absolutely illegal, not to mention that it defies the vast majority of the American people who've gone on record saying, way back in November, the American people were already convinced they had seen quite enough of this horrific genocide. Recently it's been pointed out that Israeli soldiers, the IDF, purposely shoot children in the head. And we're seeing, young children brought into emergency rooms, basically, on the verge of death from this campaign to assassinate children. So, this is a horrible war. The American people vehemently oppose it, and it is a dereliction of duty for the White House to have passed the baton for commander-in-chief over to Bibi Netanyahu. They need to end this genocidal war right now.
Here's why I think it's so hard to take many Democrats seriously when they say that democracy itself is existential in this election, but then propose delegitimizing tactics against third-party candidates, even though they're perfectly willing. Tim Walz said recently, for instance, he wants to abolish the Electoral College, the reason being they think it's an unfair advantage to Republicans. So my point being, Democrats are happy to propose sweeping changes to the constitutional system. So they could propose, for instance, to neutralize the threat of third parties playing a spoiler effect, they could propose ranked choice voting. Whereas if the first candidate, does not get the plurality of votes, then the vote automatically goes to the second choice candidate. So you could have it where somebody's first vote is for Jill Stein, but if you don't get 51% of the vote, or however it works, then that vote goes to Kamala Harris. So you're not stealing that vote if that's, indeed how people are thinking. But I never hear them proposing that. So how can I take it seriously?
Exactly. In fact, they do just the opposite. And ranked choice voting, to explain it very simply, this is a little oversimplified. You get to rank your choices instead of just voting for one, kind of calculating your odds and making a roll of the dice. Your vote should not be a roll of the dice. Your vote should be a statement about, where you want to go. If your vote is not a statement about where you want to go and what your values are, that you oppose genocide, that you want to spend our tax dollars. Right now, half of our congressional budget is being spent on the endless war machine, one catastrophic war after another, especially in the Middle East. If you want those dollars to be spent here at home, addressing our urgent needs to support small businesses, for healthcare as a human right for everyone, for affordable housing, to deal with the climate crisis. If you want to spend our dollars on our urgent needs here at home, you can cast that vote as number one in ranked choice voting, and you can cast your safety vote if you think there is a lesser evil here, and good luck figuring out which one it is. You can make your number two choice your lesser evil choice. But the point is, there is a record. And also the way that this works is in ranked choice voting, if your first choice doesn't win on the first count, the majority of the vote, then your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. So you're never throwing your vote away. You never have to worry about a divided vote or unintended consequences of the vote. And you have to record your vote if you ever want to move us forward. Otherwise, there is no evidence that there is opposition to genocide, or that there is a deeply felt need for healthcare as a human right. We need to be able to say what it is we want in this election. And the Democrats not only do not support ranked choice voting, they actively fight it. They're contesting it because they rely on fear campaigning. They want to extort your vote. Why do they rely on fear? Because they want to serve their big donors. And if they're serving their big donors, they can't talk about healthcare as a human right, or they can't talk about supporting small businesses and breaking up, the big corporate conglomerates through antitrust laws, or affordable housing and an initiative, a major initiative to build public housing, so-called social housing, and actually meet our urgent needs. They don't want to talk about that because they want to basically keep pleasing their big donors They are bought and paid for. They have delivered a political system that is bought and paid for, and the American people deserve other choices. And before I forget, I just want to mention JillStein2024.com. You can find out more there and hear about what it is that the Democrats are absolutely terrified that you should find out about in this election.
Yeah, but Dr. Stein, if we just have time for one more question quickly, I take many of the points that you make about bad faith arguments and so forth being made. But, you know, when you talk about, for example, healthcare or housing, many people who aren't operating in bad faith think that Donald Trump would be worse for those issues than Kamala Harris. I understand that you feel there's an imperative to give people an alternative view, that you're very opposed to the genocide and all of that, as many reasonable people are. But does it give you any pause, the possibility that your candidacy might in effect make a second Trump term more likely?
Both candidates give me pause. And let me just tell you what one of the most realistic risks right now, one of the biggest devastating and catastrophic risks, is that Israel goes ahead and does what it says, that it's going to attack Iran. It will probably attack the nuclear facilities in Iran. Could Russia be brought in? Yes, they certainly could, and they have expressed, their support. They're in a military alliance with Iran. I'm actually, frankly, very concerned about the potential for another. We're already in an expanding and catastrophic Middle East war, and it's on the verge of expanding right now, thanks to the efforts of Bibi Netanyahu to generalize this war, and thanks to the support of the Biden-Harris administration, which they have expressed across the board. Would Trump do the same thing? Yeah, probably he would. So, in my view, we need to stand up and vote right now to avert a catastrophe. And remember, the draft is back. The draft is back. If you're between 18 and 25, you are registered. You don't know a thing about it, but you have been automatically registered and they know how to find you. And all it takes is for the White House to declare that we're now in another wartime situation. Biden has already expressed the commitment to send boots on the ground, and they have begun doing so. There are many soldiers, some 40,000 that are in the Middle East, and there are 5,000 servicemen and women with each of the aircraft carrier battle groups, and there are 2 of them right now in that region, and there are more that are going right now in order to so-called defend Israel. So, the whole draft could be reactivated. I'm as frightened about that right now. This isn't some future thing. This is right now. We have fascism here right now when you have Democrats supporting the IDF, training our local police forces through cop cities, the suppression of free speech, to protest. We don't need for Donald Trump for the catastrophe to be here right now. It's important that we stand up for the values and for the democratic rights that we deserve. We can create an America that works for all of us, but we got to stand up and demand it right now.
We at Rising so much believe in platforming other voices, doing what the mainstream media has failed to do in terms of letting you hear from the other candidates. That's why the day after the Biden-Trump debate, we had on RFK Jr. and Chase Oliver, the Libertarian Party candidate, and, of course, Dr. Stein. And we were happy to welcome you back today. Thanks so much for being with us.
Great to be with you. Enjoy it.
Former President Donald Trump made appeals to Latino voters in a Univision Town hall on Wednesday. Trump touted his record on the economy, but refused to forgo the lies that Haitian immigrants were eating cats and dogs. Here was his response to an undecided voter's question about the Haitian conspiracy.
Do you really believe that these people are eating the people's pets?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And this was just reported. I was just saying what was reported. That's been reported. And eating other things, too, that they're not supposed to be. But this is, all I do is report. I was there, I'm going to be there, and we're going to take a look, and I'll give you a full report when I do. But that's been in the newspapers and reported pretty broadly.
Trump responded to a voter's question on his action, or perhaps his lack thereof, on January the 6th, 2021.
You had hundreds of thousands of people come to Washington. They didn't come because of me. They came because of the election. They thought the election was a rigged election, and that's why they came. Some of those people went down to the Capitol. I said, peacefully and patriotically, nothing done wrong at all, nothing done wrong. And action was taken, strong action. Ashley Babbitt was killed. Nobody was killed. There were no guns down there. We didn't have guns. The others had guns, but we didn't have guns. And when I say we, these are people that walked down. This was a tiny percentage of the overall, which nobody sees and nobody shows. But that was a day of love from the standpoint of the millions. It's like hundreds of thousands. It could have been the largest group I've ever spoken before. They asked me to speak. I went and I spoke.
Now, while Latinos have a long history of voting for Democrats, Trump has grown his support among this community of voters with his economic message. Here he was advocating for a growth economy.
We had the best economy that we've ever had. We're going to have that again. What's going to solve the problem is growth. It's a thing called growth that nobody even talks about from the Democrat standpoint because they don't know about growth. But we're going to bring companies in. We're going to bring tremendous business to our country. And that's going to solve that. Also, waste, fraud, and abuse. And we have Elon Musk, who's a fantastic guy and a fantastic genius. He's a genius at a lot of things, but he's a great business person.
So how do you think Trump fared here, Niall?
I mean, I think the Haitian stuff continues to damage him, and that excuse that he gives whenever he is called upon things that are either lies or hyperbole, that, you know, oh, many people are saying it, or I was only repeating something that has been reported. I think that's very unpersuasive, especially on a topic as explosive as that fiction that he pushed there that really endangered people in Springfield, Ohio. Now, more broadly, there is, of course, the question about his apparent inroads that he's making with Latinos. I think it is, as you noted, the economic message that is resonating there, as well as some of the cultural messages. We still expect Kamala Harris to win a pretty clear plurality of the Latino vote. And just one asterisk, Robby, I'm just talking here about the Latino vote, but of course that label tends to overgeneralize, in my view, many, many different communities. You know, Cuban Americans in Florida have very different views, including within their own generations, from, say, Mexican Americans in California, or people who are Latino but have lived in southern Texas for generation after generation. So just put that in there into the mix.
Right. I mean, some of those people scarcely even identify themselves under that terminology. Well, one does, in fact, wonder. I wonder. A friend of mine pointed this out to me. How many decades from now will we just lump this group of voters in with white voters, as we have done for, the Irish Americans or the Italian Americans? Right. Although I've been talking a lot about my Italian ancestry. My grandmother emailed me the other day to remind viewers that I also have strong German roots, and it's a more complicated a picture than that. So thank you, Grandma, for that reminder. I do read all your emails. In terms of Trump's performance there, I think it was obviously smart of him to do this. He is doing a lot better with minority voters than past Republican candidates. That's mostly about his appeal to just men overall, that men and women are starting to split more than, so we have depolarization based on race, and we have polarization around gender and around income and education status. As this new Republican Party that Donald Trump leads is trying, and it's on some level successful, appealing to working class or lower class men, regardless of race and that sort of thing. So it is interesting to see him continue to make that case. The economy is an issue that certainly seems to register with the people watching Univision, and he talking about. Now, I don't know if Elon is maybe super popular in this. Okay, he might be. I don't know. He's been appealing to Elon a lot lately. I wonder if Elon is going to be in the next Trump administration. The puppet master behind the man behind the curtain.
I think there was some suggestion that Trump might offer Elon some kind of position, which, of course, if we ever got to that stage, would set social media, including Elon's own X, aflame yet again. But there is obviously
it would be a distraction. Elon needs to build a Mars colony. He doesn't have time to. I don't even like that he's running a social media site all the time. He's building machines that catch rockets beautifully after they descend from space? Like, let's keep our eye on the prize here, Elon. While I'm sure you would do a great job running the Government Accountability and Efficiency Office, I think we can get someone of slightly less vital importance to the expansion of the human race into interstellar travel than you.
He's doing a lot better, in my view, in the catching the rockets than he is on running X, but that would get us into a whole other separate conversation. Look, the Latino thing, I do think it's really interesting the way politics is splitting increasingly along educational lines and along income lines, and less so around ethnicity. I think that's actually one of the big overarching changes in American politics that we've seen, even within the past, I would say 5 to 10 years anyway. And I think how that shakes out will be really fascinating. And I do think, just to be somewhat unifying here in a sense, the fact that Trump did the Univision Town Hall on the same night as Harris did a Fox News interview, like, let's see more of candidates going before audiences or interviewers that would be expected to at least have some rigor or skepticism toward them. I think that's a far healthier sign than people showing up for very softball interviews to be told how right they are about everything.
Yeah, and I love the town hall format anyway, because it gets at, what real people are caring about. Now, of course, they're more constructed and manufactured than we'd like them to be, because the network picks who attends and whose questions are getting asked, and probably, I assume, while I don't know and have not participated in one before, is, I would guess, pre-screening the questions to some degree, seeing what's going to be asked to make sure they get a range of questions, some more friendly, some more confrontational, that sort of thing. But I still think it could be more instructive than just necessarily what a host has to say, what's top of mind for them. And you got Trump getting some rather pointed questions. One from a supporter who just finds his conduct on January 6th unacceptable and said so. Someone, again, who called him out for the Haitian, the pets thing. And, journalists, interviewers, moderators can do that stuff as well. But it I think, can be more effective in some cases when it comes from the common folks. So I would encourage both candidates, all candidates, to do a lot more of the town halls. That does it for us today on Rising. Thank you so much for tuning in, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while we're on the go, we're now available anywhere that you can get your podcast fix. See you later.